All right, so our next session in regards to the full SLO process is on assessment literacy. And I have two apologies to make here before we get started. The first one is my voice. I've had the flu, and I apologize in advance for the graspiness. And then the second thing is, Vicki, this is going to be repetitive to what your staff saw. And so just kind of talk a little bit about this is kind of an overview of assessment literacy. And then our next session in March will go into the meat and potatoes of that process. Then in April, we're going to talk about teachers and formative assessment and collecting that data and what that would look like. And then finally, in May, we'll end with the student involvement in the process. Okay, so we're kind of over the hump of the hill, guys. Now, when we're talking assessment literacy, I want you to think about quality of assessments and the creation of these pre and post tests. What's interesting enough is at our high school principal meeting recently, we were talking about how a lot of people are getting away from pre and post test for observation purposes or evaluation purposes, growth data, due to the lack of the validity. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today is how do you create that validity? What are the steps in order to do so? Because your pre and your post are a huge part of the student learning process, objective process. And if you don't trust your own assessments, then you're not going to trust your objectives or your outcomes, and it's null and void then for educator evaluation purposes. So we're going to start with the end in mind, right? We think about our assessments. And so when we think about pre-assessments, why do we need them? I think the biggest lesson we need to make sure everybody understands is that they're not a watered down version of the post-assessment. So many times I've talked with teachers in regards to their pre-assessments, and all they do is for example, at secondary level, they'll take their exams, they'll water it down, and they'll give it. Well, your students are not going to perform well, and that's giving you no information because they haven't been taught any of it. So pre-assessments should contain prerequisites as well as new skills. So that way you can see what skill sets your kids have if they have the right ones to move forward with the lesson. And then in addition to that, there may be some advancement there, and you want to make sure you address that. The other challenge is you don't want to overuse or grade pre-assessments. One of the biggest arguments that I hear is that kids don't care about pre-assessments because it's not graded. Well, they're not meant to be graded. And I think part of the lack of engagement or doing well is because the students don't see the value. You really have to build the value and give the students the feedback. And that involves the student process, which we'll cover in May. Also, teachers need to learn to use the data. So many times I see teachers give a pre-assessment, but then they don't use the data. They still cover the same thing. They don't go through their power standards or their learning targets and modify them based on what the data tells them, which is what they should be doing. Key is, of course, they're going to show growth from pre to post. I had a teacher once who was excited because they performed 20% on the pre-test and 50% of the kids then performed on the post-test. And that was 30% growth they indicated, but I was like, what about the other 50%? So you need to think about, yes, of course, they're going to show growth. What is mastery on the post-assessment in regards to the pre-assessment? Skip lightly. Teachers need to learn to let things go. Once again, use the data. It doesn't have to be just multiple choice, true, false. It can be, a project-based. It can essay. They can demonstrate their writing skills, and then you turn around and have them do it again, and you do the comparison. And it's meant to be formative by nature, not summative. In relation to that is your post-assessment, and it should be tied to the student learning objectives and the pre-test data. So you should have similar items that are the core content being taught, both the pre and the post, so you can show that student growth. Students need to have celebrations and feedback using this data, and it can be used to show not only student growth for the student and for the student, by the student, which is the primary focus, but also for the teacher. Okay, summative by nature, but I think one of the things that we always need to consider is what do you do if a student doesn't meet the learning objectives on that summative assessment? That's always a challenging question because a lot of times we just keep moving forward. All right, so what I want you to do is think about some criteria for quality assessments. When we're developing assessments, think about your building. All right. Here's a list of criteria for these quality assessments, and based out of Wayne Risa and some work that they're doing with student growth. Rate your building. 2 being fully ingrained, 0 not yet ingrained in regards to learning expectations. Details of the assessment expectations, accessible and fair for all students. Is it designed to measure growth for individual students, instructionally sensitive to standards, the design, scoring, and are there cut scores for student progress? How are you measuring student mastery? What is the level of proficiency that they need? So just take a minute, and I'm going to stop the video here, and I want you to rate your building and then reflect on your building in regards to these pieces of the assessment.